The door of the Providence Gulch town office closed with a sound like a breaking bone. It was a flat, final crack that echoed in the cold air and sealed Ilara's old life shut. In her palm, pressed so hard the edges cut into her skin, were 20 silver dollars, her husband's final wages from the collapsed silver mine, and the town's final word on the matter. Mr. Graves, the mayor and primary stakeholder in the mine, had not met her eyes. He had pushed the coins and a folded deed across the polished table, his voice a low murmur of false sympathy. "A tragedy," he had said, his gaze fixed on the inkwell. "But the mine is a fickle beast. This plot of land was your husband's, north of the creek. The town considers our obligation settled." She had not spoken. Words were useless currency here. She knew the land he meant. It was not a plot. It was a scar, a sheer cliff face of worthless granite and scree that the old prospectors called the Widow's Folly. No one had ever managed to build on it, farm it, or find a single flake of color in its barren rock. It was a place you were sent to be forgotten. The deed felt as cold and heavy as a gravestone in her hand. Outside, the town watched her. She saw faces in the windows of Gable's Mercantile, figures pausing on the boardwalk. They saw a woman of 24, made a widow by the town's ambition, now cast out with a pittance and a joke of an inheritance. She had the clothes she wore, a sturdy wool dress, worn boots, a patched coat, and a canvas sack containing a whetstone, a tinderbox, and a small cast-iron skillet. By her side, her husband's lanky hound Buster whined softly, pressing his head against her leg. He was all she had left of that life, that warmth. Mr. Gable himself stepped out from his store, a man whose opinions were as solid and square as his build. He looked at her, his expression a careful mixture of pity and disapproval. "Ilara," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet street, "there's a wagon train heading east in the morning. $20 would buy you a ticket clear to the flatlands. No sense in chasing a ghost on that rock pile." It was sensible advice. It was the advice of a world that had chewed her up and was now politely suggesting she spit herself out. She looked at his solid, well-fed face, at the warm light spilling from his shop, and felt a cold, hard thing settle in her chest. It was not despair. It was resolve, forged in the sudden, silent furnace of her loss. She turned from his gaze and walked toward the blacksmith's shed at the edge of town. She spent 3 of her precious dollars on a good felling axe, its handle straight-grained hickory, its head a heavy wedge of dark-oiled steel. She spent another 2 on a shovel and a pry bar. The smith, a man with more kindness in his heart than most, threw in a length of rope and a sad shake of his head. Her remaining $15 were folded and tucked deep into a pocket. She did not look back at the town. With Buster trotting at her heel, a sack on her back, and the axe balanced on her shoulder, she turned her face to the north and began to walk. The town of Providence Gulch expected her to vanish. They expected her to fail, to freeze, to crawl back begging, or to be found in the spring thaw. Ilara had other plans. The journey to the Folly was only 5 miles, but each mile felt like a deliberate step away from the world of men. The wagon road dwindled to a game trail, and the trail eventually disappeared into a dense thicket of pine and unforgiving rock. The weight of the tools was a biting reality, the straps of her sack digging into her shoulders. The wind sharpened, a blade coming off the high peaks, carrying the first premonition of winter. Buster stayed close, his tail low, sniffing the unfamiliar air with a nervous energy. When she finally broke through the last line of trees, she saw it, and for the first time since the office door had closed, the cold resolve in her chest wavered, replaced by a wave of pure, gut-wrenching despair. The town had not exaggerated. It was worse than she remembered. A sheer wall of gray granite rose hundreds of feet, fractured and bleak. At its base was a steep slope of loose rock and gravel, impossible to farm, impossible to build upon, The deed was for this vertical wasteland. Tucked into the base of the cliff was a dark slash, a shallow cave no deeper than a wagon bed, its floor a mess of fallen stone and damp earth. This was her inheritance, a hole in a rock. She dropped her sack, the tools clattering on the stones. Her knees felt weak, and the cold wind stung her eyes, blurring the hopeless sight before her. Buster whined again, sensing the shift in her, and nudged her hand with his wet nose. The town was right. Mr. Gable was right. This was a place to die. She sank onto a cold boulder, the axe slipping from her numb fingers, and stared at the useless, mocking piece of earth that was now her entire world. The enormity of her task, of her solitude, crashed down on her like a physical blow. She sat there for an hour as the sun dipped lower, the shadows growing long and cold. The wind howled over the top of the cliff, but down here, at the base, she realized the air was strangely still. The sound of the gale was a roar above her, but not a single branch on the stunted pines nearby trembled. She stood up, her joints stiff, and walked toward the cliff face. As she neared the stone, she felt it. A subtle but undeniable change in the air. The biting edge of the wind was gone, cut off as if by a wall. She placed a bare hand on the granite. It was cold, but it was a dead cold, not the life-stealing chill of the wind. The rock was a shield. She stepped into the mouth of the shallow cave, Buster following at her heels. Inside, the stillness was absolute. The air was cold, yes, but it was a stable, cellar-like cold. It did not move. It did not claw at her. She ran her hand along the back wall of the cave and felt a slick dampness. Following it with her fingers, she found a tiny, persistent trickle of water weeping from a crack in the rock and disappearing into the dirt floor. It was a seep, clean and constant. Then she looked up. High above, near the cave's ceiling, was a dark fissure, a vertical crack snaking its way up into the heart of the mountain. A faint draft moved against her cheek, flowing upwards. It was a natural chimney. The despair in her chest did not vanish, but it receded, pushed back by a flicker of something else. A grim, calculating spark. The town saw a worthless hole, a folly. She was beginning to see the bones of a house. The cliff was not a wall to block her, but a wall to build against. It offered shelter from the wind, a source of water, and a way to carry smoke. The rock itself, she knew from old miners' tales, would hold the heat of a fire like a giant stone oven. It had thermal mass. This wasn't a grave. It was a foundation. The first week was a blur of brutal, punishing labor. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and cooking, were the first casualties. They blistered, the blisters broke, and the raw skin beneath bled. She learned to wrap them in strips of cloth from her petticoat. Her muscles screamed with a fire she had never known, an agony that settled deep in her back and shoulders. Every morning she woke before dawn, her body a single, unified ache, and forced herself to move. Her first task was to clear the cave. She used the pry bar and her own strength to move the fallen rocks, sorting them into piles outside. The larger ones would be for the foundation of her wall, the smaller ones for fill. She shoveled out loose dirt and debris, digging down to a solid rock floor. The cave was small, perhaps 12 feet wide and 10 feet deep, but with the rubble gone, it felt larger. This would be the heart of her home, the warm, protected core. Next came the trees. She felled pines from the thicket below the scree slope, choosing straight, thick trunks. The crack of the axe was a sharp, lonely sound in the vast silence. Learning to drop a tree where she wanted it was a painful process of trial and error. More than once she had to scramble away from a falling trunk that twisted unexpectedly. With Buster's help, sometimes using him as a second anchor on the rope, she hauled the logs up the slope one by one. It was torturous work. Each log felt like it weighed more than she did, digging into her shoulders, sliding back, catching on rocks. By the end of each day she would collapse in the mouth of the cave, too exhausted to eat. and sleep a dead, dreamless sleep wrapped in her coat with the dog pressed against her for warmth. She was building a wall across the front of the cave, extending it outward to create a small, rectangular room. The base was made of the largest stones she could move, dry stacked and fitted together with painstaking care. On top of this stone foundation, she began to lay the logs. She cut notches in them with her axe, fitting them together at the corners. The gaps between the logs were enormous. She knew they would need to be chinked, but for now, the goal was the structure. A wall against the world. She left a narrow opening for a door and a smaller square for a window. As the walls rose, she began the most crucial part of the shelter, the fireplace. She chose a spot against the back wall of the stone cave, where the rock was smoothest. She built a hearth of flat stones and began constructing a fireplace and chimney base from more rocks, mortaring them together with a mixture of clay she found near the seep, water, and dried grass. It was slow, messy work. She built the stone chimney up until it met the natural fissure in the ceiling. The rock itself would become the back of the fireplace, a massive stone heart, designed to soak up heat and radiate it back into the room long after the flames died down. She roofed the new room with smaller logs, laying them close together and then covering them with a thick layer of pine boughs, dirt, and finally flat stones scavenged from the slope. It was a heavy, solid roof, angled to shed snow and designed to hold. For the door, she used the straightest planks she could split from a large pine log, lashing them together with rope and hanging the clumsy thing in the opening. It was ugly and heavy, but it closed. She covered the window opening with a piece of stretched, greased hide she scavenged from a deer carcass she found in the woods. It let in a dim, murky light, but it kept out the wind. The final step was the chinking. She spent days mixing clay and dried moss into a thick paste and forcing it into every crack and gap in the log walls, inside and out. Her fingers were raw, the clay sucking the warmth from them, but she was relentless. She sealed every hole, every chink where the cold could enter. When she was finished, the small structure was nearly airtight. The interior was dark and smelled of damp earth, clay, and fresh-cut pine. The first fire was a sacred moment. She laid wood in the new fireplace, her hands trembling slightly. With her tinder box, she struck a spark and nurtured it into a flame. The dry kindling caught, and smoke, for one heart-stopping moment, billowed into the room. Then, as if drawn by a giant breath, it swirled and was pulled up the stone chimney, disappearing into the fissure above. It worked. The draft was perfect. The fire roared to life, and a wave of heat began to push back against the deep, permanent cold of the cave. She sat on the floor, Buster curled at her feet, and watched the flames. For the first time in weeks, she felt a profound, bone-deep warmth. It was more than just the fire. It was the heat of her own labor, the warmth of a life she was building with her own 2 hands. She was still there. After a month of relentless work, the shelter was habitable. But a shelter was not enough for survival. She needed systems. Her water system was the simplest. The seep in the back of the cave provided a steady, if slow, supply. She dug a basin into the rock floor beneath it and spent 3 days lining it meticulously with the same clay she'd used for chinking, packing it down until it was watertight. It held nearly 10 gallons, a small cistern that refilled itself constantly. Clean, cold water inside her home, safe from freezing. Food was the next challenge. The land outside was useless for farming, but inside, the cave's temperature was constant. She designated a section of the new room near the stone wall that soaked up the fire's heat for a garden. She hauled buckets of the richest soil she could find in the woods below, a back-breaking task, and built 3 raised beds framed with rocks. The dim light from the hide window was not enough for most plants, but it was enough, she hoped, for some. This brought her to her next great necessity, a trip back to Providence Gulch. She dreaded it. Facing their pity and scorn felt harder than hauling logs, but she needed supplies she could not fashion herself. Seeds, salt, a few chickens, and if she could afford it, a pregnant goat. She left at dawn, leaving Buster to guard the shelter, her $15 clutched in her pocket. Walking into Gable's Mercantile was like stepping into another world. The air was warm, thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and dried apples. People stopped talking when she entered. They stared at her clothes, stained with dirt and pine pitch, at her face, thinner and weathered, and at her hands, which were now calloused and scarred. Mr. Gable stood behind the counter, his face unreadable. "Back so soon, Elara?" he asked. His tone was not unkind, but it was weighted with the certainty of her failure. "The eastbound wagon leaves tomorrow." "I need supplies," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She ignored the whispers from the other customers. She asked for a bag of potato starts, turnip and carrot seeds, a large sack of salt, and 50 feet of wire. Gable raised an eyebrow. "Gardening up on that rock pile?" "Something like that," she replied, counting out her coins. Then she asked the question that made the whispers stop and turn to outright murmurs of disbelief. "Do you know anyone selling laying hens? And a goat in milk?" Gable stared at her as if she had lost her mind. The idea was absurd. Keeping livestock on the Folly, with winter coming on? It was madness. He directed her to a small farm on the edge of town. A flicker of something. Was it grudging respect or just morbid curiosity in his eyes? She bought 4 hens and a sturdy-looking nanny goat with her last few dollars. The journey back was a spectacle. A woman, alone, herding a goat and carrying 4 squawking chickens in a crate through the main street of Providence Gulch. The children pointed. The adults shook their heads. She heard a new name being whispered as she passed. The Cave Widow. It was meant to be cruel, a brand of pity and mockery. She did not let it touch her. She was focused on the precious, noisy life she was leading back to her stone fortress. She built a pen for the animals in a corner of the main room, partitioned off with a low stone wall and some of the wire she had bought. It was close quarters, but the animals' body heat would add to the warmth of the shelter. The goat, which she named Daisy, proved to be a calm and steady companion. The chickens, after a few days of confusion, began to peck around their enclosure. 2 days later, she found her first egg in a nest of straw. It was small and brown and perfect. She cooked it in her skillet over the fire, sharing a piece with Buster. It was the most satisfying meal of her life. She had shelter, she had warmth, she had water, and now she had a source of fresh food. The systems were beginning to connect. As autumn deepened, turning the aspens to shivering gold, Elara settled into a new rhythm. The town of Providence Gulch and its opinions faded, becoming a distant memory. Her world shrank to the size of her homestead, a small circle of light and life carved out of the wilderness. Her days were governed by simple, relentless routines. She woke in darkness, the only light the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. The first task was always the fire. She would add wood, coaxing the flames back to life. The sound of the crackling logs and the sight of the dancing light was a daily reassurance against the vast, cold silence outside. While the shelter warmed, she would milk Daisy, her hands working rhythmically, the warm milk hissing into a wooden bucket. The milk was a miracle. She drank it fresh and learned to make a simple, soft cheese that she would salt and store. After milking, she tended the other animals. The chickens were fed scraps and foraged grubs, their soft clucking a constant, gentle sound in the background. Their eggs were a daily treasure, a reliable source of protein. Buster, her silent companion, was always at her side. He was more than a pet. He was a partner in her survival. He stood guard, his keen ears picking up the snap of a twig or the distant howl of a wolf long before she could. His presence was a quiet comfort in the profound solitude, a living warmth to press against during the long, dark nights. Her indoor garden required constant attention. She watered the beds from the cistern, turning the soil, keeping a careful watch on the precious green shoots that pushed their way up into the dim light. The potatoes, turnips, and carrots grew slowly underground, unseen but promised. The hardy kale she had planted grew surprisingly well, its dark leaves a vibrant splash of color in the earthen room. It was a strange, subterranean farm, powered by the earth's stable temperature and the fire's ambient heat. The largest part of her day was dedicated to wood. She knew the winter would be long and brutal, and firewood was life. She spent hours every afternoon in the forest below her cliff, felling dead trees with her axe. She would limb them, cut the trunks into manageable lengths, and haul the wood, piece by piece, up the slope to her home. She stacked it against the outer wall of her shelter, creating another layer of insulation. The woodpile grew into a massive, reassuring bulwark against the coming cold. It was the physical manifestation of her foresight and her labor. One afternoon in late October, as she was splitting logs, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Mr. Gable. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, pretending to be out hunting, but she knew he had come to see. He stood for a long time, just looking. He saw the sealed shelter, the smoke curling invisibly from the cliff face far above, the massive woodpile. He saw her, her face smudged with soot, swinging the heavy axe with an easy, practiced rhythm. "Still here, then," he called out, his voice laced with a surprise he could not conceal. "Still here," she answered, not stopping her work. He walked closer, his eyes taking in the details of her construction, the solid stone base, the tightly chinked logs, the heavy functional door. He shook his head slowly. "The whole town's been talking, calling you the cave widow. They say you've lost your senses." He paused, looking at the formidable wood pile. "Looks to me like you've found them." She finally stopped, leaning on the axe handle. "Winter is coming, Mr. Gable." "That it is," he said, a new unsettled tone in his voice. "We're expecting a hard one." He looked from her shelter to the sky, then back again. He said nothing more, just turned and walked back the way he came, leaving Alara alone with the ringing of her axe in the cold, clear air. The mockery of the town felt distant now, irrelevant. Her world was real. It was made of stone and wood and fire and work. November brought the first real test. A pack of wolves, driven down from the high country by an early snow, found her homestead. She was woken one night by Buster's ferocious barking. Peering through a small crack in the door, she saw a dozen pairs of yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. They circled the shelter, drawn by the smell of the goat. But her walls were stone and log. Her door was thick. They could find no purchase, no way in. They howled in frustration, their calls echoing off the cliff face, but they were locked out. She stood behind the door, a burning brand from the fire in her hand, her heart pounding, but she was safe. Her home was a fortress. The wolves eventually gave up and moved on, their howls fading into the distance. The system had held. December arrived like a hammer. The sky turned a flat, bruised gray, and the temperature plummeted. The deep winter began. The world outside her shelter became a hostile landscape of wind and ice. But inside, her routine was an anchor. The rhythms of her life were a quiet defiance of the chaos outside. The fire never went out. The animals were warm and fed. The vegetables in her garden grew, slow and steady. She ate roasted turnips and potatoes, kale salads, and fresh eggs. She had goat's milk and cheese. She was not just surviving. In her own isolated way, she was thriving. The solitude was immense, a physical presence, but it was not lonely. Her life was full of purpose. Every task, from banking the fire at night to mending a tear in her coat, was essential. She was the sovereign of a kingdom of one room, her reign absolute and her responsibility total. The first blizzard of the season hit just after the new year. It was a preview, a warning shot from the mountains. For 3 days the snow fell and the wind shrieked. She did not leave the shelter. She had wood, water, and food. The wind tore at the roof and hammered against the walls, but the cliff protected her from its full force. The stone and log structure barely shuddered. The fire burned steadily, the great stone wall behind it soaking up the heat and turning her small home into a warm, safe cocoon. When the storm finally broke and she opened the door, she looked out onto a world transformed, buried under 4 feet of silent white snow. It was beautiful and terrifying, and it had not touched her. The real storm arrived in the 3rd week of January. Later, the survivors would call it the Great Blizzard of '83. It did not come like a normal storm. It descended like an invading army. The sky went from clear to white in less than an hour. The wind came first, a low moan that rose to a piercing, unholy shriek. It was a sound that seemed to want to tear the world apart. Then the snow began, not as flakes, but as a solid horizontal wall of ice and powder. Outside Alara's shelter, the world ceased to exist. There was no up or down, no land or sky, only the screaming white chaos. The wind hit the cliff face with the force of a physical blow, but the rock absorbed it. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that vibrated through the stone, but inside her home it was muffled. The shelter was a ship in a hurricane, anchored to the heart of the mountain. She calmly went about her chores. She fed the animals, who were restless but safe. She tended her fire, the flames a steady, mesmerizing dance of orange against the stone. The great rock wall behind the hearth was now a massive radiator, pulsing a deep, even warmth throughout the room. The air was snug and dry. She sat by the fire, mending a sock, listening to the storm trying to claw its way in. She felt no fear, only a profound sense of gratitude for every log she had hauled, every stone she had lifted, every handful of clay she had pressed into the walls. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. In Providence Gulch, the storm was not a muffled roar. It was the apocalypse. The town was built on an open flat, its wooden structures completely exposed to the wind's fury. The blizzard hit them like a freight train. The fine, powdery snow was driven by hurricane-force winds, finding its way through every crack and crevice. It sifted under doors, through window frames, and down chimneys. The conventional preparations of the townspeople were useless against such a force. Their wood piles, stacked in open-sided sheds, were buried under impassable drifts in the first few hours. The church steeple, the town's proudest landmark, cracked and then tore away, its bell silenced. The roof of the meeting hall, where several families had gathered for safety, began to groan under the impossible weight of the snow. Inside their homes, people fought a losing battle. Fires sputtered and died as chimneys clogged with ice and snow. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that slipped through the walls and floors. Livestock, left in hastily built barns, began to freeze to death. The town's confidence, its sturdy, sensible way of life, was being systematically dismantled. Panic began to set in. Families huddled together under blankets, their firewood gone, listening to the storm trying to devour their homes. The community that had mocked Ilara's foolishness was breaking apart, its infrastructure collapsing house by wooden house. They were learning, too late, that their safety had always been an illusion, a brief period of calm between storms. On the 2nd day of the blizzard, the wind shifted, and the temperature dropped to a level no one in the territory had ever experienced. It was a deep, killing cold, a cold that froze breath in the air and made wood as brittle as glass. This was the breaking point. This was when the dying began. Ilara knew nothing of this. Her world remained one of warmth and order. The storm was an abstract concept, a noise outside her walls. But on the evening of the 2nd day she heard a new sound, one that cut through the roar of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her heavy wooden door. Buster erupted into a frenzy of barking, hackles raised. Ilara grabbed a heavy piece of firewood, her heart suddenly pounding. No animal could be making that sound. She moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Through the storm, she heard a voice, thin and shredded by the wind. "Please, help! Is anyone there?" She braced herself and lifted the heavy bar securing the door. With a great heave, she pulled it inward. A blast of wind and ice exploded into the room, and a figure, completely covered in snow, stumbled and collapsed onto the floor. It was a woman. Ilara fought to close and bar the door against the storm's fury. She turned to the figure on the floor, brushing away the snow. It was Mr. Gable's daughter, Mary. Her face was pale with cold, her lips blue. She was Thomas's wife, a young woman who had always looked at Ilara with a mixture of fear and pity. "My husband," Mary gasped, her voice a raw whisper. "Thomas, he went to check on the livestock. The rope, it snapped. He's out there, lost." She looked at Ilara, her eyes wide with terror and desperation. They said you lived, that you were safe. Please, you have to help." Here was the choice, the daughter of the man who had led the chorus of mockers, begging for help at her door. To go out into that storm was suicide. To risk her own carefully guarded safety for the people who had scorned her. A bitter memory of their whispers, of the name Cave Widow, flashed through her mind. She looked at the warmth of her fire, the calm of her animals, the small, perfect world she had built. Then she looked at the desperate, freezing woman on her floor. The choice was not a choice at all. It was simply who she was. "Get by the fire," Ilara said, her voice calm and steady. "Take off your wet things." She moved with purpose, pulling on her thickest coat and wrapping her face in wool. She grabbed the length of rope she'd bought from the blacksmith and a lit lantern. Thomas had been a good man, quiet and hard-working, and he was married to this terrified woman. That was all that mattered. "Buster," she commanded, "find." The dog, seeming to understand the gravity of the mission, whined once and then stood by the door, ready. She tied one end of the rope around her waist and handed the other to Mary. "Hold this. Do not let go. If I tug 3 times, pull with all your might." Opening the door again was like opening the airlock to a dead planet. The storm snatched the breath from her lungs. The lantern cast a pathetic, swirling glow that was swallowed by the white darkness just a few feet away. But Buster was already moving, his head down, his powerful nose to the ground, casting back and forth. Ilara followed the dog, leaning into the wind, the rope a lifeline back to the one small point of warmth and safety in a world of frozen chaos. They found Thomas less than 100 yards from the shelter. He had fallen into a snow-filled ditch, disoriented and half-frozen. He was barely conscious. Getting him back was a nightmare. He was a dead weight, and the wind fought them for every inch. Ilara and Buster, working together, dragged and pulled him through the blinding snow. Twice she slipped and fell, the rope in Mary's hands the only thing that kept her from being swept away. Finally, gasping and covered in ice, they stumbled back through the door and collapsed into the stunning, life-giving warmth of the shelter. Mary and Thomas Gable stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. The warmth hit them first, a solid, tangible thing that melted the ice from their clothes and brought painful life back to their frozen faces. Then came the sights and sounds, the soft clucking of chickens in a clean, dry pen, a goat placidly chewing her cud, the impossible sight of green kale growing in neat rows against the far wall, a small cistern of clear water, shelves neatly stacked with preserved food and tools, and the fire, a huge controlled blaze in a stone hearth that heated the very rock of the mountain. They were not in a cave, they were in a home, a fortress, a work of raw, undeniable genius. It was warm, ordered, and utterly self-sufficient. They looked from the impossible shelter to the woman who had built it, the cave widow, the fool on the rock pile. She was calmly ladling hot broth into bowls, her movements efficient and sure. "We were wrong," Mary whispered, the words catching in her throat. She looked at Alara, her eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to see. "We all were. We pitied you. We called you a fool." Thomas, wrapped in a thick blanket by the fire, could only nod. "My God," he murmured, looking at the seamless join between the log wall and the stone of the cave. "How?" Alara handed them the bowls of broth. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat or demand an apology. Her victory was not in their shame, but in the simple, undeniable fact of the warm broth, the solid roof, and the beating hearts of the people she had just saved. "There is food," she said quietly. "Eat. You need your strength." Her response was a kindness more stunning than the shelter itself. It was grace. In the face of their mockery, their dismissal, their profound error, she offered not judgment, but warmth and sustenance. They huddled by the fire, the life-saving heat sinking into their bones, and wept. The blizzard raged for another full day. Late on the third night, when the wind finally began to subside, another visitor arrived. This time it was Mr. Gable himself, leading a small party of men from the town. They had fought their way through the drifts, half mad with worry, following the faint hope that Mary had made it to the folly. When Alara opened the door to his frantic knocking, he stared past her and saw his daughter and son-in-law, alive and warm, sleeping by the fire. Gable stumbled inside, his face a mask of exhaustion and disbelief. He took in the same scene that had stunned his daughter, and the rigid certainty that had defined his entire life seemed to crumble. He looked at the thriving garden, the healthy livestock, the massive radiating fireplace. He looked at the woman he had advised to run away. He turned to Alara, his eyes raw with emotion. We were the fools," he said, his voice thick. "The meeting hall roof collapsed. We've lost people, the town. It's broken. And you." He gestured around the room at a loss for words. "You are safe. You built this." Alara simply nodded. "There is broth left," she said, "and I have blankets for your men." In the silent, exhausted hours before dawn, the small shelter became a refuge. Alara moved among the men, offering what she had. She shared her food, her warmth, her impossible sanctuary. She listened as they told stories of collapsed roofs and frozen families. She did it all with a quiet, powerful dignity that shamed them more than any accusation could have. She had been cast out, and in the end her folly had become their salvation. When the storm finally broke, revealing a world buried and silent, the survivors of Providence Gulch looked upon Alara with something akin to awe. The story of the rescue, of the impossible shelter in the cliff, spread like wildfire. The derisive nickname, the Cave Widow, was retired overnight. In its place, people began to speak her name, Alara, with a new tone of deep, unshakable respect. The immediate aftermath of the blizzard transformed her relationship with the town. They did not come with pity anymore. They came with questions. They came to trade, offering valuable goods for her winter vegetables and fresh eggs. They came to learn. Mr. Gable was the first. He spent an entire day at her homestead, not speaking much, but watching. He studied how she had used the cliff as a windbreak, how the fireplace heated the stone, how she had captured the water seep. He left with a sketchbook full of drawings and a humble thank you. Others followed. They saw that her survival was not luck. It was a result of intelligent design, relentless work, and a deep understanding of the natural world. She had not fought the environment. She had partnered with it. She had taken its greatest weaknesses, the brutal wind, the crushing cold, and used the landscape itself to neutralize them. The spring that followed the great blizzard was a season of rebuilding in Providence Gulch, but it was a different kind of building. No one wanted to erect another flimsy wooden box on the exposed flatlands. Led by Mr. Gable, They began to survey the surrounding hillsides and valleys. They started building new homes, not on top of the land, but into it. They began to dig into hillsides, building what became known as Ilara shelters. They used stone and earth for insulation, oriented the houses away from the prevailing winds, and designed them for thermal mass. Ilara never sought a position of leadership. She had no desire to be a mayor or a teacher, but she became a wellspring of quiet wisdom. She shared her knowledge freely, showing people how to mix clay mortar, how to site a foundation to catch the winter sun, how to build a fireplace that stored heat. Her homestead became a landmark, a testament to what one person could achieve through resilience and ingenuity. Travelers passing through the territory heard her story and carried it with them. The tale of the widow's folly that became a town's salvation spread to other settlements, and the principles of her design began to appear in shelters all across the high country. The landscape itself began to change, dotted with homes that hunkered into the earth, prepared and respectful of the power of the wilderness. Ilara lived out her days on the land that had been meant as her exile. She expanded her home, adding a small greenhouse against the cliff face and a larger enclosure for her animals. She never remarried, finding a deep and abiding peace in her solitude and her work. Her life was not one of riches or fame, but of profound substance. She had faced the worst of nature and the worst of human judgment, and had triumphed not through anger or revenge, but through the quiet, unyielding act of building something that would last. Years later, as an old woman with hands as gnarled and strong as oak roots, she would sit by her door in the evenings, Buster's descendants sleeping at her feet. She would watch the sun set over the valley, over the town of Providence Gulch, now a community of sturdy, earth-sheltered homes, safe and prepared. She had been stripped of everything, left with nothing but a worthless piece of rock. But on that rock she had built more than a shelter. She had built a life, a legacy, and had proven that the things the world dismisses as worthless often hold the deepest value. Her strength had not been in opposing the storm, but in knowing where to stand to let it pass.